And so for me, like, I didn't grow up with the business bug, but I think being in the band, I think it's interesting, like how much like being in a band is like being in a small business or a startup.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't
Mm-hmm.
recognize it then at all. When I began to put two and two together when I was like 24, 25, oh, me hand selling my CD in the line at Warped Tour, that was me learning how to sell and
Yeah.
like putting those things together, right? And so the fact that it took me a long time to be like, okay, I think I do have a mind for business because I really care about people. I mean, there are people who like I was saying about this one guy at the construction company, like, yeah, he's got a big business and he picked me to help bring that story forth. People can start a business like to make money and they can do a good job of that without
Yeah.
feeling any sort of deep empathy and love for people. But like I
Right.
said before, like the reason why I do this isn't, yes, I want to make you money, but that's a byproduct because I want you to give a shit about your audience. So I
Right.
feel like if you don't care about your audience, it's just that much harder for you to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And some people can do that. Some people can be successful without doing that. But that's not how I live. That's not my integrity. You know what I mean? And that's not like what I feel like, if you want to put a spiritual spin on it, like that's not who I feel like God made me to be.
Welcome back to the Everyday Innovation Podcast. Today, we have Matthew Nanes, a multi-skilled creative with a nonlinear journey that's led him to brand storytelling and advising as the brand bard. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm looking forward to going through this entire conversation of what's taking you to this spot of storytelling and brand messaging. And I think we're going to learn a lot from you today. So I appreciate having you here. So what are you learning about or reading right now? Because I feel like a lot of creators in the creative space are always doing some sort of personal development, learning a new skill, whatever that might be. So what are you into right now?
Yeah, I actually have a stack right here. I feel like within the past couple of years of doing my own thing, there's been a lot of the like honing and learning sort of thing. So I actually have a stack right here. So this is like an everyday book that I have. So How to Launch a Brand by
Nice.
Fabian Gearhalter. Because the brand storytelling thing, as far as like how like a brand strategist would do it, like
Mm-hmm.
we can get into it a little bit later, but I just kind of like fell into it. But once I fell into it, I was like, can I cuss on this, by the way?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So it was just like, holy shit, like I found what I've been looking for because like, I
Yes.
loved the storytelling aspect, but how can I make storytelling into something that's a bit more tangible and useful for brands? Not to say what I've done before like in my career wasn't useful, but like I always felt like I was trying to put makeup on a pig, right? So I would always be in like these situations where it's like, well, I would come in as someone who was an outsider and I was getting my own inspiration, but I would want to do something, but I would either be told like, no, like we're not sure about that. But it's like just being able to get into the ground level of things and making sure there's a good foundation to build upon, whether it's content or anything else. So that book has been really, really good because along the way I've been picking things up, but that's been a good way for me to be like, okay, what sort of biases or hunches were
Mm-hmm.
correct, what not. So I mean, you can see how beat up this book is. Like, it's not just being in my backpack. Like,
And that's what you
it's a
should be doing.
reference,
You should be
you know.
like, this is something I thought about recently. I'm
Mhm,
beating up a book currently, and it's the one that I'm doing that challenge on. And I'm like, why
mhm.
am I not just writing the heck out of these books? You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? I think we often feel like, oh, we're going to save it for another day, or maybe we'll lend
Mhm.
it to somebody. Who cares?
Then I feel guilty for not like reading like fiction or anything like that. And so
There's
I
seasons for
try.
it.
Yeah, for sure. And I have a feeling the fiction season is coming back. For instance, I started reading Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I started reading her. I moved to Tennessee for a bit, so like might as well read some Southern Gothic stuff, and she's great. But I read a couple short stories the other night just to get the palate cleanser. But to finish up, like what I've been reading as far as like the nonfiction stuff, Donald Miller, Marketing Made So Simple. He does Story Brand, basically taking one of like the story frameworks, the hero's journey, but he's made it very simplified. But I come from an English background, so I was already very familiar with the hero's journey. But like it was interesting to see how people have made it palatable for marketing. And so, because there are folks who implement it who come from like marketing backgrounds, and they say storytelling, but like I would say most of them aren't a dork about it like I am, because as far as like my educational background goes. But then one last one. So Finn McKenty, he is a YouTuber, does the punk rock MBA. I had him on my podcast, but I've stayed in touch with him, and he suggested this book, Expert Secrets by Russell Brunson. And
that was a recent suggestion to me. How are you liking it?
So far, it's pretty good. It's like stuff I feel like I've already known already, but it's like being put in a way that's like, it's like a review for me.
Yeah. Or there's sometimes you pick up on something like just because it's rephrased or it's coming from a different voice or instrument. You know what I mean? It's like, it just lands differently, or it lands differently in the season that you're in and whatever you're working on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm a natural skeptic. And so like, as far as like the title goes, I hate it. Like Expert Secrets.
It sounds like a ebook that like, someone's trying to push on LinkedIn or something, right?
Right. Or it's that, or like, I come from Utah, which is like the land of MLMs. And and so I have that sort of resistance already. But the fact that he recommended the book to me in the first place was like, okay.
Yeah.
I'll do whatever you say. I'll buy it.
That's the power of like a personal brand, because those kind of recommendations come with a lot more credibility, because you're not just looking at the market, you're looking at like, who's recommending this? I was even thinking about that today. There are a few things that I like, really, if I think about my buying patterns, a lot of it is, it's not like influencer necessarily, but there are people that I trust their opinion, or they do a lot of research, and I'm like, okay, I'll probably buy it from that, as opposed to probably sometimes even from the source, which kind of stinks, because unfortunately, like that's kind of what happens, because you're always going to hype up your own stuff. So it's like you hope that you can build a community around it, that people are willing to share it and share it authentically.
Yeah. And it's funny to talk about like trust and everything too, because my origin story, as far as like working with brands on a very like deeper level, comes from my time working at a company called Expert Voice, where the biggest part of what we wanted to do was cultivate trust and affinity for brands from an audience. And so the power of like recommendation was like all we were all about, whether it's like educating a brand or a product, because if you're more educated about a brand or a product, you're more likely to recommend it to someone. And so the fact that he did that, I know that if you're going to have someone with that much like influence, air quotes for those like who are not watching, is like, I'd be stupid not to take that. Like, oh, this guy who he has 2 YouTube channels as far as his personal brand goes that are getting millions of plays. Like, I would be so stupid not to spend like $10 on buying a book.
Right. Seriously. At least just like seeing maybe where they're coming from, even if it's not your thing, there may be something from it that like, I get it. Maybe it's not my journey or my cup of tea, but I'm still learning something from this.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I have another little warm-up question, and then we can dive in. But let me see. I'm going to mix these up. Okay. Oh, okay. This is a good one. And we're probably going to get into a lot of this over your journey, but what creative mediums do you naturally gravitate towards? It's probably a hard one because you're kind of multi-passionate.
That is hard, because I feel like it's been so good that I've been influenced by so many different parts of media, whether it's like audio or written. I feel like it comes and goes in phases, especially like how it fits into my own personal life. I tend to, whether if I have a lot of alone time and things aren't so busy, I'm going to gravitate toward writing. Right. But I feel like audio and video, like, if you're doing video, you're doing audio, right? And so it's just that much easier to fit into like my own life. And I'm also a very impatient person. And so sometimes I don't have the patience to make an outline of what I'm going to write and then do it, right?
Yes.
And so I think I favor video slash audio a little, like a lot more these days, because I listen to a lot of music, but I listen to a lot of podcasts too. And I just feel like it's so much easier to ingest.
A lot of times it really does depend on your lifestyle, what your current like creative process is. Because there's times where I've had a lot of resistance with writing, or a lot of resistance with video, or a lot of resistance certain types of audio things, just because the format wasn't kind of in flow with how my thoughts were moving through. So that totally makes sense. And that also makes sense for like the kind of project you're working on, because some things just lean better toward a certain format or a certain medium, and you feel called to create in that space or create in a couple spaces, I guess, and see how that works together.
Yeah. And I think the thing about writing is that, I'm a late learner of like having like, being like having ADHD, right? You probably can hear and see a little bit of
we can get into. I feel like this is like the podcast where I don't know if everybody is, but I have a lot of neurodivergent people on. Just I am myself, so it's I probably could guess based on all the things that you do and the way that you do it and the kind of things that you're into and the strategy and systems behind it. But as somebody who's late to it, you were saying for writing, it's tough.
Well, like in some ways it's tough, but also the strength in it is that I feel like I'm a bit more understood when I do write, when I take the time to do it. So that's the plus of writing, because that's one thing, like I think in my life, that one of my biggest needs is to be understood as a person. But on the other hand, with audio and video, like people can really get to see and know me.
Yes.
In my Instagram, there's not really anything doctored about it. Like I don't use filters. Like, I mean, I'll do captions because I'm a big caption guy, because music has made me deaf.
Same.
So
that's the only way. I'm the person who watches TV or movies and I need the captions, or else I'm like, I have no idea what you just said, like, even if I'm looking straight at your mouth. Yeah. Totally.
And so I feel like as far as if I'm being like quote unquote authentic, I think that's probably the best medium. So like it's a give and take for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're saying that, because I think especially if you're late diagnosed like I was, you have a certain amount of masking that you've created in that the way that you express yourself. So certain ways that you may express yourself, like writing, you may feel more understood by your intention of it, but it sometimes feels less authentic because you're putting that masking layer in it. You're putting that other maybe extra filter or extra
so much editing.
Pizzazz. Like I'm sure our natural writing, I don't know if you're like this, but like I'm the person who ends up putting like a parenthesis. So I have like a side thought in the middle of the thought if I were to just write unhinged.
Yeah,
and
lots of hyphens, lots of like
yes, you're like
thoughts.
I need to also bring in this point here. Yeah, when you're speaking or when you're on video, that can be done without it being as maybe obvious or tough for someone to follow along with, because they can also see the inflection in your tone, or they're saying, oh, I can tell by the way their movement is that they're bringing in a piece from somewhere, just how they're. So the good thing about it too is you can transcribe. There's lots of great AI out there that can transcribe now, and then you can maybe edit that. So
and I think that's like I'm not a huge like Gary Vaynerchuk acolyte or anything. I'm not like a dork about him, but like I do appreciate him a lot, and I do like listen to his content and watch his videos and stuff. But the fact that like that he's the books that he has, like he's not writing them, he's talking and having other people like dictate, or at least now probably like through AI or whatever, and they're just cleaning it up. So like if you're to think about whenever I do my content strategies for brands, like writing is kind of like at the bottom of like the filter, so to speak, because having that audio is like such a huge boon to be able to mine and fish, and having like a program like Descript or Riverside even has AI right now, which is like, thank God, because I like them a lot. Like through my podcast, like I could have a whole book of like the interviews. Like I have like 44 or 45 episodes of my podcast. Those are different chapters. And I think that's rad. I could produce a book right now.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I was at with going to video, because similarly from Gary too, he is like the master of repurposing content. And for me, I'm all about, and I'm sure you are too, if you're multi-passionate, you have to have your systems down. You have to be efficient. If you want to do multiple things, you want to talk about all this stuff, if you want to record a lot of content, if you go up to video and audio, like essentially this kind of a podcast, and then you get to distill it more and more to shorter form content, to written pieces, to tweets. I mean, you can like out of a, you know, I'm guilty of maybe not doing enough of the marketing aspect or the communication aspect. I get to the end of it and I'm sharing a lot of the long form content, a few pieces of short form, but literally you could milk hour and a half episode for months.
Oh, yeah.
Come up with all different ways to like share the cool nuggets and put infographics with really mic drop moments. I mean, it's incredible all the things that you can do. And especially now with AI, that's really, you know, helpful in being able to help you share those pieces that maybe it's kind of tough to do, or there's a lot of resistance near the end if you've created something at that kind of higher level.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So we were in a DM and you had a really great metaphor that I resonated with, and I think a lot of people resonate with, which is following the muse. So I want that to be the intention or overarching theme of this episode, is following the muse. So what does that mean to you? And then I want to get into your background, and I would talk about your journey following the muse. So how do you describe following the muse? What does that mean to you? And what's that origin story for that?
Yeah, so I think the colloquialism is just like running off of vibes.
Vibes. Oh my God. Is it so vibes for you? I know people feel this in different ways. It's like a gut feeling. Is it like you get downloads of things that you want to do? Is it a lot of times for me, sometimes it's in response.
Yeah, I think when you bringing up like the gut feeling aspect, I think that's been a late thing for me too. As far as like, I know people, depending on who you are, as far as like, if you lead with your brain, or I don't know if the gut and the heart are different.
I feel like, people would interpret differently, but I would say the gut would probably have a lot more. It may have a little bit of logic to it, but it's a little bit more this kind of just like an inner knowing, or maybe there's an emotional component to it. That's how I feel it.
Instinctual, maybe, because like I would say maybe they're different. Now we're talking through it. The heart and the gut are different.
Yeah,
I feel like the heart is. I don't know if this is my background, but like, of course, like your heart can tell you a lot, but like I think the heart and the gut, the brain and the gut can do a lot of double checking on the heart. But for me, the instinctual stuff, I find that if I don't trust like my instincts, I tend to have a lot more like regret and maybe like whether like resentment of like different choices I've made through like, you know, my career or life or whatever. But I think it's been a late blooming thing in the past couple of years where it's like I should really trust my gut a lot more, because the stuff that I have ignored my gut on throughout my life is the stuff and be like of course, like people will say like, oh, I don't regret anything. You know, I think for the most part, like I think no, you regret something.
So yes, that's a great way of seeing it. But it's also, there are things where especially when you do have that intuition, you're like, I heard that and I ignored it.
Yeah.
And I think that you're mentioning again, the later in life, you know, especially later life diagnoses, neurodivergent people are very good at pattern recognition. So there are patterns that we're seeing that maybe are not as obvious to other people. So I don't know if you've ever met somebody where they're like, he's the best guy ever, he's whatever. And you're like, there's something I'm feeling about it. That's not, there's something that's off, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you don't trust it. Maybe it's not a person, maybe it's a project, maybe whatever it is. But there's some sort of pattern recognition there that is highly attuned, I think, in that. And we often, again, in that masking situation, don't trust it because we're like, where's the logic? I don't have the logic laid out in front of me. But it takes a lot of bravery to sit and be like, nope, I trust this feeling.
Yeah. And I think that what you bring up about logic as well is, I think for the longest time, if you were to ask me like what kind of person I am, I would say like, oh, I'm very emotional, which I am. Yes, I am very emotional. But like, as far as I've grown up and become more of an adult, like starting to lean on logic a lot in order to make sure my emotions are in check as much as they can. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but like, I think me being more in tune with them, going at least the origin story, so to speak, to start bringing that into it, is that like one of my first a few of my first memories were of like watching movies I shouldn't have been watching at 4 years old, or like watching like, yeah, that's a whole nother story as far as my upbringing goes. But like whether it be like horror movies or stuff like that. I'm okay. I think I grew up okay, with all that in mind. But like the first memories of like watching wrestling or reading a
Mhm.
comic book, which I could wax poetic about professional wrestling being its own form of storytelling and the kind of the psychology of that. But like all that being said, is that like I think some of my first memories is having these different mediums of storytelling one way or another, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something to having the visual and emotional, if you're watching a movie or whatever, having those representations, it, sparking an emotion inside you. And then if you're reading a book or a comic book, like I was at 5 or 6 years old, like I think I was just really in tune with that sort of thing. Cause I
Yeah.
think about this like every other day, cause I'll be listening to music and I'll have this thought of like, okay, this is one of the first songs I ever remember hearing. Why was it when I was like 5 or 6 or 7 years old, when I'm hearing a Beatles song for the first time, I'm feeling like emotional about it, having memories of
Mhm.
me being emotional. Like I remember
Yeah.
I was talking about the Beatles the other day to a friend, and I remember hearing the song like Nowhere Man and just being like zoned out and disassociating in the back of the minivan with my little like Walkman as a little kid, and just being like so into it and creating the
Yeah.
story in my head about this person, whoever they're singing about. And
You and I didn't realize that people didn't process things in this way, but did you have, I call it the music video in your head where you were like,
absolutely
okay. Because not
100%.
everyone sees that. I
Yeah.
was the person that had the full music video going, especially if you're in the car on an airplane
Yeah.
or something, you're listening to something, looking out the window, you can see the entire unfolding of this song into a
Hmm.
visual form, right? Is that what you
Yeah.
were experiencing?
Yeah. Like, and even like, I was joking with my family, like, as far as like the first music videos we ever like remember like watching, right?
Yeah.
Because like MTV would be on as well, in like
Yeah.
seeing music videos like Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel, like
Yeah.
that music video holds up. But I think that sparked my imagination when I'd be listening to these songs, like how would I put this together? And that would even like intensify, like even through like my junior high years as well, just being so into what I was listening and like kind of imagining the story in my head, because I always resonated with like the music videos that added to the story,
Yes.
not
Yes.
so much of the live performance, which is funny as a musician. Like you'd think I'd be like stoked about the live performance, like, lip syncy type of videos. But that was like an early, as far as like, oh, what do you want to be with when you grow up? That was like an early choice, like music video director
Oh
or
my
something like
gosh.
that.
Music video direct.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, but do you remember the box?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I lived for the
Yeah.
box. That's all I
Yeah.
had on all day. I like studied these music videos, and it was just, I thought that there would be no job in the world that would be cooler than a music
Yeah.
video director, because it's taking that, again, I think this is where we kind of have the ties on like the production side. It's like that full, you have your hands in everything and you're able to pull together an entire whatever production picture
Yeah.
composition of
Mhm.
something, and like taking that, all these pieces together, and it's a mixture of creation and curation. So you were a music video nerd too. What were you
Yeah.
doing what were you doing in junior high school? Like what were you into? Were you like into AV stuff? Were you in band? What was your like outlet?
Yeah. No, junior high, like, man, that was like, it's like Charles Dickens says, it's like it was the worst of times, it was the best of times. I would say like junior high was a lot different than high school, because I feel like high school was like the culmination of getting out at a certain point of my life, because there was a lot of family issues like in junior high. But
Mm,
like before those things started happening, because like I said, like I've always been into music as far as like I
right.
remember. And at the same time I was really into sports, like my dad was coaching all my teams. But like I I was smart enough to know that there's only certain types of people that would have a career doing that sort of things. Like you would have to be blessed being like
Hmm.
tall, or just like so just genetic freak in order to like make it, right? But I think it became
Yeah.
very
Yeah, I
clear
get that.
early on
Yeah.
that I wasn't going to get as tall as like 5'7", 5'8". but
Right.
but I also but I was also very inspired by music and wanted to do it because like I've always was it wasn't so much about like the technique or anything like that. It was all about the expression because I
Yes.
was always into tell like writing stories or writing small little comic books and also like or poetry when I was like little. And
Yeah.
seeing a band, for me, my favorite band of all time is the Smashing Pumpkins. And
Yeah.
I just remember seeing them and I just got what I said about like the live performance music videos where it's like lip syncing, like that stuff is cool. Like there's nothing cooler like and more physical about like someone beating the shit out of the drums or like
Right.
sing a solo or whatever. And so I remember seeing like an actual live performance and just seeing like the ferocity. I've always been like a physical person, very so like energy stored up in my body. You can see it right now, like on video. I'm like, oh, yeah. And I felt like the original idea was for me to be a drummer, but both of my parents were in the military and we were in base housing, which is basically just duplex upon duplex. And that was like a no-go. That wasn't going to happen.
They were, you're going to get lots of complaints.
Yes.
The early drummer phase.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the guitar was kind of like the consolation prize. And so like, thank God for the guitar because like I put everything into that. Like I've always been like a good student. So like my grades were, it kind of faltered a little bit, but they weren't ever so dire. But at the same time, I was just falling in love with guitar, like learning. I was learning songs because for me, it's all been about the expression of songwriting and bringing together lyrics and stuff like that. Some people are completely about the technical side of music, but for me, again, the storytelling aspect, right? And having those words and the music create that visual in my head in order to continue to tell my story and tell that story on a different level. And that felt like the natural thing for me to do. So I learned how to learn songs by ear. And that was a great thing because I was been able to just like not rip people off, but just like take little things that I would learn, whether guitar, like, hey, that part's awesome, and bring this over here. And that's basically like all I did, like junior high and high school. As far as like, I still played sports a little bit, but that died out. But when 16, 17, 18 hit, that's when I was playing shows. That's when I was setting goals like, okay, I think I want to be on tour and in a band because I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, but that
it's one of those things. I think I hope that in these next coming generations, we stop it with that and just say like, what do you want to be next? What's something, how can we tie in, or we can look at what are all these things you're interested in? What's the common thread there? Is there something we can find that can nourish that piece? Like for you, storytelling, you're finding this common thread amongst the things that you're doing, that expression and that composition of something.
Yeah. And that wasn't something that like, it was discouraged either. I think, as far as like, my own personal life, like my dad moved away and, my parents got divorced, but like my mom has always been very supportive of that kind of stuff. And so I think it would have been a lot different had like my dad stuck around like, no, you got to join the military or whatever else. But like, I was able to keep following, the muse, so to speak. And at least here in Utah, I went to high school in Utah. There was like two things that were kind of expected of you, whether if you were LDS/Mormon, like you were expected to either go on a 2-year mission or you went straight to school, right? There was no other option. And of course, like I had the third option of going to the military because that was my family, but like that didn't seem right either. So like, I think I followed my gut in a great way then, being like, okay, I want to join this band that had a record deal. So I was in a band like with a record deal when I was 18, and pretty much when I graduated, I went on tour like right away. And it wasn't.
When meeting these people, were these friends of yours and they needed a guitarist, or did you were you in the inception of it with them, or was someone else building it? How did that happen for you? Because I know it happens differently for different people.
Yeah. So in that particular band, like it's funny, the whole adage of like, well, like there's not a lot of bass players around, so just grab the other dude that knows guitar and give him a bass. And
so I'm not a great guitarist, but I do play, and I did have a bass for a while, and that was because I wasn't that great of a guitarist, but I could like jam on the bass a little bit. So that was
Yeah.
my way of like getting into a band, because I was a flute
Yeah.
player and piano player.
It's only
so-
one note at a time, you know,
right,
that
exactly.
joke,
Yes,
you know.
yes.
But you know, that was around like when I was 12 or 13, when I was doing bass, when I picked up the bass as well, because that was the option. You know, I was like, well, we're a three.
Yeah, because why not? I know a lot of people in bands who like sometimes they want to have like the bass line doing something else, or they want two guitars on this particular whatever. If you're in the studio, you can play both. I mean,
I think there's also a theme of being just like available and willing to help as well, because I always started going to shows like punk and hardcore shows when I was like 12, 13 years old. Yeah. And so I was just around, you know, and so if there was a local show, I was just going to be there. And so this one particular band, I started seeing their shows when I was like 14, 15. They were like kind of like a Blink 182-ish type of thing.
Yeah.
I remember not liking them at first because I'm very opinionated about music, but like I would still go to the shows because it's just what you did, you know? Yeah. And so being around and also like going to like their parties and stuff like that. So I was just around.
You're part of the culture. There's a cultural aspect to it, not just you're going to the show as a fan, but you're part of the culture as either a fellow musician. It's like the same thing. I always think of like stand-up comedy and stuff too, because I'm around a lot of that here now with like some of the actors and whatever is like I see another culture that's similar to the music culture where if there is this certain subculture within it that you're part of it and you're part of all the events. And I'm sure that created trust for you too, again, because you're showing up, they're seeing your face, they're understanding who you are. So there is an interest of like, how can we involve you?
Yeah. And I think like I think I was viewed as like the little brother because there's an age gap of like 3 or 4 years. Right. And so when they're 18, I'm 15 and I'm going to these parties and, you know, house shows and stuff like that. And so when I started becoming, you know, being in bands, and they invited one of my bands to play like a house party, so they could see like, oh wait, like Matt knows his shit.
Yeah.
And so when that band, not my band, but like, you know, this group, this band morphed into another band, they called it Day 2. It was a little bit harder, a little bit more like my taste at that time, and just being around for so much and learning by ear and being able to see them play. When it was time for them to get a new bass player, I showed up the first tryout and I knew songs inside and out without having anything recorded. I just showed up ready because I knew it by the back of my hand, because I just listening and understanding where, you know, where the notes landed. It was just kind of like, okay, like what's next? What are we going to do? And then it was kind of like a no brainer, you know. Yeah. My age was like, okay, well, we have to wait till we go on tour because they're still in school, but like the timing was just perfect. And that's so awesome. just being there and available and listening to my gut, because I had a dream to going on tour and living that lifestyle. And like, it's kind of like a double-edged sword of having like one of your like biggest dreams being fulfilled when you're that young.
Yes. It's not necessarily like maybe not the dream anymore. Maybe it wasn't exactly what you thought it was going to be. It's not that it's necessarily disappointing. It's just like so cool. But then you're like, okay, now what? Now what? Yeah. Yep. So when you were touring and everything, how long did that go on for? Did that kind of morph into some new projects?
I mean, I've always been, you know, as soon as I knew how to put 3 chords together, I was writing songs. So that had never stopped. So I'd be home from tour. Like I had a really crude, like makeshift, like I don't know if you remember, but the old desktops would have microphones like in the monitor, right?
Yes.
So like I didn't have the money to, you know, get a whole. At one point, I did have a 4-track recorder, but I didn't know what to do with that. Like, I mean, I did enough to be like, oh, I can hear myself, but like once I knew that there were programs out there that would basically like multi-track your music and you can layer things. Once I figured that out, that's when I started getting into the production as far as like.
So what was your first program that you used? I'm just curious.
It was called N-Track Studio. I was on PC at that point. But like you were able to EQ, you're doing all this stuff. So that's when I put 2 and 2 together as far as how to do that. Like I wish I was able to. Hey, I wish I still had that 4-track because I'd actually know what to do with it now. Yeah. But like, but just being able to put all these songs together and they were like, it's not so much they weren't good because like I've still repurposed some of the stuff I've done back then into like
Yeah.
songs I've done since. But like being able to have that time when I was home to write these songs and learn the super duper basics of like music production, being able
Yeah.
to like edit and all that. So during that band, like I just was kind of just like building up like the skill of writing songs and doing lyrics.
Did you record multiple parts at any point and stuff for yourself too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like downloading like drum machines and
Yes.
programs, and
Yes.
I had the bass and stuff, and also like from I was really young when I was kind of thrown into this situation because like I look back on it now, like a young dude, 18 to 22, like you don't really know how to deal with people or even emotions, and so the songwriting aspect was like such a huge thing for me because like I mean, even back then I had big emotions. I have big emotions now, but back then, holy shit. And so like and therapy was taboo back then, and I didn't even think of therapy back then. And so that was basically when people say like, oh, music is my therapy, like it's easy to brush it off. But back then, like for a guy like who put everything onto paper, like that was it. Like that was my comfort zone right there. And so kind of getting the reps, doing the live, playing almost every day for a year and a half and doing Warped Tour and really gritting it out. Like I just felt like that first year and a half was such an education, and I still bring it up, when I talk about even my, like as far as like the artistic stuff, but even like for the professional and career stuff, like that was like life defining, time in my life, those first 2 years. And then I've been in bands, like touring bands after that as well. But like when I was trying to slowly figure out what I wanted to do with my life, but man, like that was college. That was real. That was like
I feel like people underestimate these young artists and stuff too, but there is so much. Like I remember looking at old lyrics and I was like, oh my gosh, like seriously, it was therapy, right? And you go through and you look at it and there's so much that it resonates, like as even an older adult, it's just a different maybe lens. And there's a lot of emotion that's there. There's a lot of things that are still being processed and raw. And it's so beautiful. And then you're also just diving into learning this new space. Like your brain is like ripe for all of that. So you have this space where you can just like experiment and do it without having that sort of consequence of like, oh my God, how am I going to make rent this month? Or how am I going to like, or you're starting to get into that space, but it's not as dire as when you have, a wife and kids or, whatever that might be. Like for somebody, you don't have a lot of these other obligations yet. So your brain can get out of any of sort of that survival mode and get into that experimentation and whatever. And I think we can continue to chase that, and we try to recreate that throughout our life because it's hard to get back into that mental state, especially to get older and you have more things on your plate. So what was that sort of next step for you? Where were you kind of like, okay, I got to start figuring out some things, or I need to either have some like a main project type of thing that I'm working on, or I need some other things to bring in some income. Like what was that thought process for you to be like, I don't necessarily want to be doing maybe only the music all the time?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was when I had this thought. I think it was like in central Illinois. Like we had just played the band I was playing in at the time. We just did this festival and it was really, really good. It was a lot of fun, but like I could kind of see the writing on the wall with that particular project because like we had recorded a record prior to that and kind of understanding where that particular project was going. And I'm not going to say the name, but there was a moment where this solo artist I was working with got an offer to go on tour with Paramore during the Riot tour.
Yeah.
But they wanted him to do this one thing that he was known for, but he was moving away from it. Yeah. And from a pure business point of view, you're just like, well, no shit, you do that. But he was very, very like hard nosed about what he wanted to do creatively, which like looking back, I can see like that integrity. Like I respect that a lot. But understanding like, well, if I'm going to be with you and be on this ride, so to speak, but you're not going to take a really crazy opportunity like that, like maybe I should start thinking. So I was in the van like after this festival, like okay, I think it's time for me to go to school now. And it's not like I was even throwing away my own personal project. I mean, I haven't even said what that was called. It's called Swans and Never, and I've showed you a song.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
I have the recording. I'm going to put that
yeah.
in the show notes. I'll
Okay,
make
great.
sure that that's there.
And so that's something like I've always done. So it's not like I went to school and I stopped writing and recording. Like,
Right.
that's not the case at all. But I think it was like I tapping into that more like the gut instinct and following that muse, so to speak, to be like, there's got to be something more to this. Like the dream, like I've achieved it, and
Yeah.
it was just time. Like I had done a couple semesters before that point, but I think I really honed in on what I really wanted to do finally. And I think that was really important because like to kind of go along with the flow, like I can do that. And, you know, sometimes like to a detriment, I do that in my personal life, but like to be able to have that instinctual be like, no, this is what I'm going to do. Like I usually, once I figure that out, I usually go for it full bore.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I was very focused on getting that degree, which I went to the University of Utah for English. And that was also like, I mean, some people go to school like, oh, I don't really use what I've learned. I think for a while that was the case for me. But once I kind of figured out whether like my own like personal belief or you know, as far as like how important storytelling is, like within the past couple years, I'd be like, okay, I'm really glad I went to school because people make jokes about like English majors all the time. And then people just assume that like the next part of your life is like, oh, you're going to be an English teacher, which I was close to doing that. But understanding like there's a way for me to incorporate like my love of, you know, storytelling into all of the, you know, the skills I've learned along the way in my professional career. Like it's been like kind of like the perfect amalgamation of kind of everything my life has led up to at this point. Right. And so I think that's why, you know, as far as my career has gone, I've been left and right, like, okay, I guess I'll take this job because it's what's in front of me. But like, I'm thankful for all those now because like, I feel like I've been multidisciplinary at that point. Because like I was saying before, like learning how to edit music when I was 16, 17, I've been able to rope in like 50 to 60K in sponsorship for a job sponsorships for content for a job I had because I was producing all this stuff. So like all these small, like dumb things, like quote unquote dumb things I've learned when I was a kid and was interested in writing, production, like even like going back to the music video stuff, like being able to produce videos for brands. Like, I mean, it's not a music video. So it's not like that.
But there's still, there's a lot of the same, a lot of these things are still a very similar process, a very similar kind of operation strategy. Like when you're thinking through solving the problem, it's very similar. There's just small tweaks to it. It's the focus of it, or just maybe part of the execution of it. But that's what's so cool is because if you can start to understand that process, you can translate that into different mediums, into different spaces for different people, for different types of clients. And you're not limited to one form of expression, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think having that experience of being in bands, of living so closely and creating so closely with 3 to 5 other dudes, it's, you learn how to play nice.
And you learn how to actually like collaborate and speak through things and probably have a certain level of like, I don't want to say humility, but like there's like like when it's your baby, your creative idea. And I'm sure you deal with this and you're talking about people's brands and you're going through and you're workshopping ideas. You know, sometimes it's very hard. You get stuck on certain ideas, but then when you kind of talk them through and work through them together, you're like, wait, this is actually better if we put this here and here. But sometimes you have to go through that process of working out the kinks together as opposed to just sitting alone with your own idea and then just running with it. You know, it's a little different.
And I think like there was still a lot of humility that I needed to learn along the way, even in my career as far as a collaboration goes, because like I think if you really want like the most intense collaboration, like yes, being a band, figuring out how to write a song, like absolutely the band setting is like insane. But there's also the danger of being like, well, I know my stuff, I'm great, why can't you see it? All that stuff had to be beaten out of me over time as well, even into my my career. So I think when I started to understand the emotional IQ of it all, right, of like understanding that, like, no, like, yeah, you might be good at what you do, but other people have great ideas as well. I think that has helped me out a lot in having that humility, you know, through different situations in my life. But as far as the collaboration aspects, being in a band, like my friend, I have a friend who he's a drummer, and he was in like a semi big band, actually toured a lot for years and years and years. He's a sales guy, but he's also a creative, right? I remember he had this blog that he posted that whenever he applied to jobs, he always included this link and it says why you should hire a musician. And it was just great, like, blog detailing why people like us make us special and why you should hire us, especially those of us who have toured. And so I don't know if anyone's listening who has hiring decisions.
Please. I was really passionate about music education, not necessarily like for myself to teach it, but just I know how important it was in my life, my own personal development, brain development, all the different things. And yeah, I would always be digging up all these amazing articles where I'm like, look at what it does. Look at what a great employee you can be. I love that advocacy because it's an often cut program in a lot of places too. In education, I'm not saying that anything is any more important. I'm not saying that sports is not important or that academics and whatever. It's just there was a certain, I feel like it just wasn't getting its due, just like some of the other arts. So I love to hear that. Yeah. So he was on tour, sales guy, has his job. So the feeling of this sort of, you're not ever not a musician, right? You're kind of like an full-time working musician, right? How does this kind of lead into these next projects? Like, so what were you doing first?
Yeah. So the first job I as far as the big boy job, directly related to my education, I was a copywriter at overstock.com, which is now Bed Bath and Beyond. And basically that was just like a product content farm, right? Like I was doing like 50 to 60 product descriptions a day, right? So not like, I would have some interactions with brands, but not on a deep level. It's very surface level. During like the holiday season, they just like crack the whip, like hundreds of products. But I got this opportunity at this spot called Expert Voice, where it was an online platform where it had its own special audience of people who are either like super into a certain category, whether it's like outdoors or whatever else, cycling, that kind of thing, or apparel. Or they're like retail workers. So the whole idea is like we're creating special content specifically for this audience. So it's not like something where we're creating content that's getting blasted in an ad, right? It's like, no, this is content for people who are either dorks about what this brand or they have to sell it to recommend it.
So ultimate niche.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so fortunately, like this was a value proposition that a lot of brands really love. Like, okay, we're going to have people in retail be able to recommend us because they have a deeper level of understanding. Yes, sign us up. And so really, like I was there for about a year. Sometimes it was like white label, like type of work.
Yeah.
But there was a shift where I know a lot of people throw around the word like authentic these days, but like internally we're going to tell like authentic stories where we were going to be an advocate for our audience. We would pitch these content ideas to like huge brands. For me, like the one I always kind of put a pin on is like Wrangler, right? And it was that particular, because I did 2 pieces of content with him. And that first one was like the rubber hit the road of being like, yeah, there's a certain like idea of, I'm working with this brand, but I'm really intimidated by it. But that was the first time where I was like, these people don't know how to tell their stories either.
I think this is very common, is there is a skill that you have that you feel that everyone has, or you think comes because it comes easy to you. It should be coming easier to other people. But then you're looking at it and you're like, this seems obvious.
Yeah.
When really it's not obvious, even with millions and millions of dollars backing you.
Yeah. It was insane. Like, because at that time I was looking at their website, and I looked at their website the other day, and not much has changed since 2017. And like, you guys are a pillar. this particular audience, like, why aren't you playing this up? Why aren't you owning your shit of being like, yeah, like our legacy, this is our legacy, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to pitch certain ideas to them and having them say yes to things, it was like, okay, if I can do that with these guys, I can do this with anyone, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's like a sort of like hubris that comes along with that when you feel like you've unlocked it. Like,
Yeah.
so you're coming to these brands and being like, well, this is what this audience wants. They have questions, they have needs. This is what you need to do it to tell that particular story. And of course, like there's pushback, but learning to be able to take feedback and then, have that conversation to be like, no, like we're experts in this space. We know our audience. This is what you should do. And there's also an e-commerce aspect to it as well. And so we knew that people were engaging and buying their product too. So being able to be like, well, people really had a lot of hard questions for your brand, but this story and be able to build this trust and affinity, we were able to answer a lot of those questions and you made money because of it. And
right. Like data is amazing and data can come in all different forms. I think sometimes when you spend a lot of money on research, it's tough because sometimes the data will tell different stories, right? You have to work along with that, but then you also have to play the game too and be like, here's how this can lead to X, or maybe the reason why this was an oversight was because it's in this specific area and there's a big uptick in kind of where these people are coming from now, or your new customers. And sometimes it's hard to see through just all, you can analyze the numbers all you want and analyze your interviews and whatever, but sometimes it does take those outside eyes. That's why I'm always such an advocate for people to get consultants and get other eyes on like their brand and just looking at things because when you're in the midst of it, you sometimes don't even get the same information that someone from the outside will get. I'm sure it is such a relief to have somebody be able to articulate or see and connect the dots for them.
Having that, a third party come along. You got the customers and you got the brand, but then you have like little old me being like, actually,
that conversation sometimes can't happen, right? Like it's very hard for a brand and the customers, and you see this on social media all the time. It's kind of awkward. Like there is that love for the brand, but a lot of times there needs to be that almost third party. That's sometimes I think why that sort of influencer culture is good because there is that kind of third party maybe connecting the two and communicating. And then on your end, you're like that third party in the consultation of understanding how to communicate these things. It can be awkward. It's like, in the end, it's a relationship. And sometimes you need that kind of third person or like a therapist. You're like a brand therapist to be there to translate some things.
Yeah, very recently, like especially like getting into like more like brand storytelling, even more in the past couple of years. Like I've had that. A couple of recent clients have said that, like, this feels like therapy, And for me, for someone who's finally like gotten into therapy for myself, I think that's such a great compliment because, it does take someone from the outside to really tell you the truth about stuff. And I think, especially with like influencer marketing, like there is a level of artifice because people,
of course.
Because like, I think people got into influencer marketing because it was seen as real, as authentic. When I do scare quotes about authenticity, like that's the kind of stuff I mean, because like, I think there's always going to be a level of authenticity or not, depending what it is. But I think my job is to be as real as I can as far as the thing that I'm suggesting or the things that I'm putting forth to these brands as far as what story they should tell, just to be as real as I can, knowing the fact that you're in it to make money. But for me, it's like, you're going to make money because you're fostering a real story and real relationship. Like the money is a byproduct.
Yes. Yeah. Because the branding really is about their perception. So you can't really control it, but you can make sure that you're showing up and expressing yourself in the, like you were saying, and not air quotes authenticity, but in an authentic way that you are attracting the people that are meant to be attracted to your brand, and not just the people that you feel like you should be attracting, right? Or that, or because that's, I feel like, I'm sure, a common problem too. So what is the biggest issue do you see? How can I say this in fewer words? Like, how do I express this? How can I write my bio? Where do you think is like the hardest, what's the hardest part about storytelling for people? Is it just the not understanding? So what do you think is the biggest issue?
If I were to have a blanket issue, I think it would just be empathy for your audience, because I think if you have empathy, you're able to solve a lot of other problems, right? Because I think, of course, storytelling frameworks, yada, yada, yada. I can like do all this like kind of feel good academic ways to put something together. And all that is great. I love that shit. I really, really do. But there was a moment where I was working with a regional construction company, and this guy was super old school in his thinking. Like he had been in business for like 30 years. Of course, like they're doing well. Like they're not doing well despite this. You know what I mean? But when I'm sitting there talking to him, trying to get him to put himself in the customer's shoes, why it's wrong that they're facing the problem that they're having, he comes back to me and saying, like, well, that's just life. People are going to have problems. Yeah. And I feel like if you can't do that, you can't really articulate why you're an option to help them. Right. And so for me, like, I didn't grow up with the business bug, but I think being in the band, I think it's interesting, like how much like being in a band is like being in like a small business or a startup. But I didn't recognize it then at all. When I began to put two and two together when I was like 24, 25, me hand selling my CD in the line at Warped Tour, that was me learning how to sell and like putting those things together, right? And so the fact that it took me a long time to be like, okay, I think I do have a mind for business because I really care about people. I mean, there are people who, like I was saying about this one guy at the construction company, like, yeah, he's got a big business and he picked me to help bring that story forth. People can start a business like to make money, and they can do a good job of that without feeling any sort of deep empathy and love for people. But like I said before, like the reason why I do this isn't, yes, I want to make you money, but that's a byproduct because I want you to give a shit about your audience. So I feel like if you don't care about your audience, it's just that much harder for you to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And some people can do that. Some people can be successful without doing that. But that's not how I live. That's not my integrity. You know what I mean? And that's not like what I feel like, if you want to put a spiritual spin on it, like that's not who I feel like God made me to be,
Right.
Like this is how I'm going to do what I'm going to do. If this is how you're going to do what you do, that's fine. That's you. But if you're interested in working with me to put a little bit more soul and feeling and to what you're doing, okay, let's do this,
You were saying, like, here's a storytelling framework, or here's this, which is always nice for reflection, and maybe it'll start to organize your thoughts a bit, and that's sometimes very, very helpful for people.
Yeah, definitely.
But it definitely makes sense that empathy for the customer. It's not even just the empathy, like you were saying, because that's almost a little bit more extreme of like, well, they're just going to deal with it. But a lot of people also are so focused on the product itself or themselves as the whatever it is, the entertainer, the creator, the whatever, that it starts to become a lot more about them or the product, even if they don't mean it to be, or they're not trying to be narcissistic or any of that. It's just I need to focus on the product. I need to focus on the content. I need to focus on this, but then they're losing who's receiving it. Where's the impact going to be if it's not going to land with somebody? You have to be talking to somebody else. You're just talking. You might as well just talk to the wall and, have fun. It's just, I totally understand what you're saying. And so when you're kind of researching like the audience of people, how are you doing that? How do you do that research for a client? And maybe how can we learn from that for ourselves?
Yeah. I think if you're just starting and you don't really have any customers, that's really hard to do. But I do think you can make an educated guess and of course make a persona, right? Like you're going to make an assumption like, yes, I'm going to market to moms from ages 30 to 40 or whatever. Like that's,
yeah.
you can make those assumptions. And if you're having empathy, you can understand like, okay, like this is their problem. This is how we're going to solve it. But when the rubber meets the road and you're working with a brand who's established, especially for instance, I was working with this cycling brand. When I started working with it, if you have an assumption like, okay, yeah, things are fine, yada, yada, yada. But then depending on, for instance, for this cycling, you're able to read reviews from cycling magazines. You're able to go to Reddit. You're able to go to message boards where it's unfiltered. People aren't like kissing your ass anymore.
No, seriously, you're going into the spots where they're not interacting with the brand. It's people interacting with one another about the brand. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's like, and of course, like if you're very cognizant, or say on Instagram, people DMing you for one reason or another, that's another thing you can do, right? But I think it's super interesting if you're able to have a brand that's like big enough within this niche that people are talking about your products in a way that doesn't involve you whatsoever. That's really interesting. And this one cycling brand, like people were losing trust over it. The products were breaking. The technology was old. And so being able to take these like literal screenshots of people saying stuff and like, here's the mirror. Here's how to listen to this.
As much as you want to say that whatever it is, it's your brand, it's also, that's your brand too. It's the kind of composition of what you're putting out there, all the things that nice and pretty and shiny and the story, but then you get to see the other half, which is the reaction to that and the ripple effect of what that means. And then you put it all together and you say, this is the brand, and that can be tough. And what would how do you advise on that? Because I'm sure that's a lot of, because brand touches all parts of strategy, which I'm sure because you're multi-passionate in the way that you are, how do you take that information back, make the changes as needed, but then also tell the story that needs to be told that it's speaking to these changes, right?
Yeah. I made a post on LinkedIn the other day that a brand is a lot like a growing kid. I have 3 kids, and as they outgrow their clothes, when you're a kid and you have a shirt that it's starting to not fit and like you feel awkward, like, okay, I got to buy new clothes, right? It's kind of like that, where you're in the world and you're doing your best to create this product, but then you're getting this feedback and you're like, depending how serious you are about your customers, you're like, okay, we need to change this. Right. Because if you're making like a brand strategy from the get-go, like that's like the best assumption you have. That's your foundation of how you're going to go forward into the world. But then you get that real world feedback. And so as someone who's worked a lot in retail, sometimes the customers are wrong. And so if there's something like some feedback that goes against like what your actual like real deal foundation passion of why you're doing it, like I think you're safe to ignore that. But then when you get into things like safety issues, like for instance with this one particular brand who had like pedals breaking when people are like going down mountains, no, you have to change that. So it should be a part of your brand strategy to be like, we're here to help cyclists perform the best they can, and if their pedals are breaking, we have to change that, right? So that way, like that brand strategy is like an armor, right? So it's one of those things that like you're able to protect yourself against just things like that, whether it's like bad feedback or bad products, that sort of thing. It's a thing you can go back to and gut check and double check like all the time. But if you're noticing like people have different uses for your products, or you're noticing a different demographic, that's the sort of thing where it's like, okay, maybe the story has to change a little bit because we're accidentally like getting this feedback. It's cyclical, right? Like as far as like certain brands, right? They'll come into fashion and they come out. So like you're seeing kids like co-opt X brand. It's like, okay, now maybe we should talk to them now, right? So that's the things that like have to change as well. So like in certain ways you have to be really steadfast in who you are and why you do it and how you do it. It just really like depends on what the feedback is. Like if you can see real life examples of either like the problems you have or even like opportunities you have, those are the things you have to be sensitive and really look at and reconsider why you do things and how you do them.
something that I just thought of. I feel like sometimes feedback, especially for early stage entrepreneurs, is I don't get it. I'm actually like asking you truly for people who are now in that, they're like in those early stages where it's very new. It's like you were saying, it's the baby version, right? You're just going out there with your assumptions. You probably have sort of an idea of your audience, but you're starting to get a little bit of feedback of maybe it's not necessarily you may be getting close to the problem, but you're not quite communicating it right. How do you make those kind of tweaks?
The runner-up answer to the question that you had about like the one thing, the runner-up question to that is simplifying. And so I think as like founders, or I think it's really easy to get really excited about the thing that you're doing. And you want to solve as many problems as possible, but that's the problem. It's like playing whack-a-mole, right? Like, okay, what problem are we solving now, right? I think Thoreau, I think Walden Pond, you know, like I had this teacher, he was like, the theme of this book is to simplify, he was talking about simplifying your life, but really simplifying your messaging to the point where you want to be so clear that you can explain to someone what you do, like with 10 to 12 words.
Right.
And so focus on solving this one problem right now, and just have that be it, because it's just so much more, it's just easier to communicate, whether it's to your customers or to investors. Like no one's eyes are going to glaze over. Imagine like, you know, getting into the hero's journey a bit, you know, of course, like in movies there are subplots, right? But they're all there to support like the main story and the main theme. So like if you throw too many subplots into a story, like you're starting to wonder, who do we care about? What do we care about? And so like Star Wars, like if, you know, of course you have like the Death Star arc, you know, blowing up the Death Star and all that. But like, what if like there is some weird like story like that goes off like in Tatooine about this other character that doesn't come back ever again? It's like, I don't know.
I think people get and it's, again, I feel like there is a blindness of being in that space of being the creative or the person that's in the muck of like creating the initial thing. So whether it's a product or whether it's something that's relating to you or your creations, whatever that might be, I think in communication, even if you can do multiple things, even if you just talk about one thing right now, and yes, it can also solve this problem, but just at least start to try to talk about that one thing, and then you'll at least connect with that group, and then try talking about that second thing it does might help in you know, in solving that. But I think I know that's been a big thing for me. And I also see it with a lot of creatives, which is just like, you have this thing and you're trying to just simplify it so someone else can understand, but you're coming from such a meta.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up meta too, because there is a time and place to do that kind of stuff, but it's like a first date, right? You're going to tell them the basics about who you are, right?
Yes.
But if we're going to tie it to like story lingo, like this isn't necessarily a part of the hero's journey, but I think it's important to talk about. I made this connection about the lore the other day, like the lore of your brand, right? So I think there is an opportunity to go deeper and show for the people who are enthusiasts, like you will care about like what this is made out of, how we did it, all that stuff. That content is cool, but it's not the thing that you're going to do at the first bit. You're not going to put that above the fold on the website right away, because then like the first person that shows up to the website and they're trying to get to know you, they might be overwhelmed. So there are opportunities to dork out about that. But I think if someone's first starting out or whatever else, or there are even brands who are huge right now that have a problem with that. They want to get into the lore super quickly rather than someone who's trying to get into you for the first time. Like you want to bring in the music parlance. So you want to hit them with like the single that's catchy.
Makes a whole lot of sense. It's really like you kind of have to zoom out a bit. I love the date thing too. I love the picking the single. You have to have that kind of quote unquote commercial viability to start to bring people in and have that relatability, and then kind of dig into the nerdy cool stuff. And like, on a first date, you're like, it's probably a red flag if you're digging into, early childhood trauma, like the first like few minutes, but maybe later that's part of the lore.
Yeah.
This is what makes me interesting. And somebody that you are dating and you care very much about, you're very into their lore.
Yeah.
But to allow people to be, what do you call it? Like just attracted into that journey as opposed to pushing it on them.
Exactly. The analogy of like dating, like it works so well because there's always, as much as we want to think about Coca-Cola, I think they're so big that they can be seen as their own person. But if, in a way, I'm not saying brands are people, but like the fact that the people behind, whether it's like a startup or a small business, like those people started those because they were so passionate about what they wanted to do. It is very much a part of who they are. And that's why whenever I do like my strategies and workshops, I very much say like, at this point, you can't hide behind the brand because your brand's not strong enough to like withhold like a lot of this other things that you're trying to do with it. Right. So the brand personality is very much going to be tied to the founder and things like that, because people are creating things and people want to connect with other people.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we're doing, when we create businesses and sharing things, or even like, if it's not business, it's art, it's
right.
feelings. It's like,
I think they're all the same. I find it like they're all expressions of ideas manifesting into form, and beyond that, not just manifesting into form, you're trying to create impact with that. And the way that you do that is usually through relationship with other people. So I want to talk a little bit about your workshop. My audience tends to be, I call them creatorpreneurs. That's what I'm working with for now. So it's a lot of people who are in the space where I personally intersect just because of my work in a lot of the creative spaces, but then also working a lot with people who are technical founders and other things where they're just as creative, but they're not necessarily seen as creative because they're kind of left brain, right brain. But really, you're just kind of bridging a lot of that gap between the two, because we're all, again, doing that all the time. They were always in the creative process. Yeah. Maybe for this group, or if people who maybe are looking at, they're working on a company and so they do have a separate brand, what are your brand workshops all about? What is that experience like?
Yeah. I mean, like I said before, like a couple of them say like, oh, it feels like therapy. So be prepared for that.
Good.
And I think if you're a small business owner or creative, like everything's personal. So yes, we definitely get personal. But what I do, talking about these storytelling, like wireframes and frameworks, I should say, the main one, like I think it just works so well for the marketing, like I was saying before, like the hero's journey. And so what I do is that, at least for the super, super basic quote unquote plan, I guess, because we could go all day if we want to. Is that like Captain America? Like I can do this all day. But basically the first hour, I'm just asking a lot of questions about like why they do it, like what they do, when they started, just really trying to get that like personal story, like out of them. Right. Yeah. Because it all begins with that. Like, why do you even want to share this in the first place? Right. And then that's a very oversimplified of what things I do, because like the questions I ask beget other questions, right?
Right. Of course.
Yeah, it's our opportunity. Like it's an opportunity for me to learn, especially if there's not a lot of resources about like what you do. Like I'm flying in blind, but that's fine, because I've worked with so many different types of brands. Like I can hang, right? But just like, yeah, it just gets into the why of it all. But then depending on how long we have, of course, like I said, super basic. I have 2 hours work with you. That flies. It sounds like a lot, but it flies, because I'm spending half of that first hour teaching you about like what the hero's journey is in the first place. Because for the people who aren't really exposed to ideas about that, or haven't really thought about storytelling in that way before, it's like, oh, it's like a brand new thing. I've had people like, oh, okay, yeah, like I get it. But then there's some people who are like, okay, yeah, all right. They have a somewhat like familiarity with it. So it also just depends on their familiarity as well, because we can blaze through the hero's journey aspect if you have some sort of familiarity. Because that second hour, like I'm asking you questions based on each part of like the storytelling journey, right?
Right.
And so that's when I get into like your customer. So if I do like a 2-hour one, I'm just doing a general audience, right? Because when I talk about like different personas and things like that, you could easily do one of these for each persona, because the way you're going to talk to these people are very, very different, Right. But that would take me, like, say if you have 4 different personas or even products. Even you could do the same thing for products. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're doing something separate for each one, but generally speaking, it's a general audience, right? And you're getting into their problems, like how is their problem making them feel, like what's the main villain in their story. It doesn't have to be a person, it could be a situation they're in, or a thing that they're feeling or coming against, and like why is it just plain wrong that they're dealing with this, right? And that was the question that hung up that one founder in construction, like why is it just plain wrong. He couldn't get past that. We got there, but we were stuck on that for a long time.
It just took a second. It took a minute to just kind of get past that block. Yeah.
It took the other people in the room and be like, well, not like other people within his company. Yeah. And so within those 2 hours, like we just bash it out. Like who's the main character in your story? And it's not the brand, it's your audience, because the brand's gonna have to be the guide, the Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Yoda, to guide them through, to teach them how to use the Force, so to speak. And so that's what we do for those 2 hours. But if you want to build a brand, like say like your colors, logos, and all these other things, like words and phrases to say, taglines, everything starts with the 2 hours we spend, or more hours, depending on what we do. That is the cornerstone of everything I do. So if a brand comes to me like, hey, we want to do this video, I'm putting you through those 2 hour paces, because like there's got to be a reason why you're doing it. Like if it's a brand that just wants to look sleek and sexy, whatever, like maybe I'm not your guy. Like I can do that. I've done that, but
you want to go deeper. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to go deeper. I want to be able to, just communicate with an audience one way or another, but I think you can do that. Like if it's just like a flashy video, but like, I just think it's important to start with that base of like trying to help people. Going into like the brand building aspect, you can get a lot from those 2 hours, and getting to know the founder, being like, okay, what's the voice? What kind of personality is this brand going to put on? In 90%, it's going to be the founder. Like if you're a founder that's a certain way, has a certain personality, but you want your brand to be something else, you can do that. It's just going to be hard for you to do if you're doing it on your own. Like that's when you want to bring in like a copywriter to embody this voice who can do it a lot better than you. So generally speaking, it all starts with that. Depending on what you want to do, there's a lot of different ways we can, go through the path of building a brand. It always starts with that. It always starts with the story.
I love that. You guys are going to check the show notes. I always have a Notion companion, but I have a feeling I'm going to take a little bit of your wisdom and put that into something really cool that you guys can check out before you book with Matthew, so that they have maybe a little prep work, something like that, before they can jump in and take it to the next steps. But I always have a couple of wrap-up questions, because I know that I'm respecting your time, and I appreciate this has been such a fun conversation. But just I always ask this on every episode. There is no definition for innovation even, but for everyday innovation, I'm curious to see, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, like as far as like being the natural like cynic and things like that, like whenever I hear like things like that, I have to kind of check myself at the door a bit, because like there are certain people like LinkedIn or things like that, the bros, you got to push yourself, like the alpha male type of stuff, that kind of stuff just like puts me off. But like, because I feel like the everyday innovation idea, when you ask me this question, it's like, well, sometimes like the everyday part like doesn't happen. There are days where I'm like, I sure as hell did not innovate that day.
Yeah.
Like if I'm being like completely honest with myself,
and then everyday can also mean everyday, meaning not necessarily having to be extraordinary
or ordinary.
Either.
Yeah.
Ordinary, everyday things,
Yeah. And in my life, like I've kind of like, of course, like I would be a part of like punk and hardcore communities and stuff like that, but there's still like a feeling like, oh, I don't necessarily like fit in with certain crowds. And what I do, there's a certain type of person, you can see how I look right now. I just like, you can't see my tattoos, but I got like tattoos, like especially like in my state, I'm definitely a sore thumb, and I feel like a sore thumb. But like as far as like I still feel like I'm pretty ordinary. I don't try to paint a prettier picture of my life than it actually is, right? But there's something to be said about learning from mistakes and innovating, like not like in the catchphrasey type of way, but just like understanding on those days where you're definitely not. Like I think it's important to be self-aware enough and be like, okay, well, what didn't work yesterday? What went wrong yesterday? And how can I make that better? Because like from where I was 10 years ago when I started, my career, and even where I was like creatively then until now, like whether it's things I've learned on a technical aspect or a creative aspect, or even becoming a quote unquote better businessman, like I'm pretty far away from where I was. 10 years, like there was a graph, it's still going exponentially up. So even though it may not be like every day, but the fact that like I've given a shit enough to put in some sort of work, the things that like that interested me, rather than like, of course there's going to be people like, you should read this book, and I'm going to do it if I like and respect you.
Right. Yeah.
But like, it's a culmination of everything I've been like passionate about. I haven't done, at least like following the Muse on a long-term base, I haven't done anything that I never loved. Yes, there's some things I've done, like, I've done SEO writing, but like, okay, that stuff generally like bores me to tears, And so I put on that jacket when I needed to.
Yeah.
And I learned what I learned, but that's not going to be who I am. That's not going to be me. So where I am now, it's just the choices I've made along the way to get, not so much get better, just get into it more. And I think the byproduct is just getting better,
Yeah.
I guess like the analogy, like, or not analogy, but like the experience I've had, I worked at a bookstore for 3 years, right? And you get really well acquainted with the different sections, the whole idea of like, you can't judge a book by its cover. Like, hell yes, you can.
Yes, you can.
And so I'd see self-improvement, right? And, especially being like the cynic, like I'd scoff at stuff, but the fact that like just over the 10 years, like it's what I've been doing in one way or another, being like improving myself as much as I can. I definitely have some scars and dirt and blood along the way, like, but in 10 years from now, whatever trouble I've been going through this year or last year or whatever else, like I know if I keep doing what I'm doing and following, what feels true to myself and my gut, my skills, what interests me, it's just going to be better,
The fact that you continue to follow the Muse, I think, is a testament in and of itself. It's you're willing to continue to follow and to grow instead of just let it go, which I think a lot of people sometimes do, and you're doing it for yourself. You're not doing it, just to be better or just to do whatever. You've made a commitment to yourself to continue to follow what you love and what you care about, what you're passionate about. And that's really its own version of that, which I think is really cool. And I like the analogy of the bookstore. Everybody's self-improvement journey looks different. And, some of them are much more like you were saying, like building a brand. Sometimes it's frameworks, and sometimes it's really just having that empathy and connecting, connecting more with yourself or connecting more with people. And speaking of people, I want to, I always like to say, because I want it to be a two-way conversation, as most things should be. But do you have any questions for the audience themselves? Anything about, it could be about branding, it could be what's your favorite band, or it could be whatever you would like. I mean, it could be any of those or multiple things if you'd like. But I like to put this out there because it's really fun to see, what you're kind of putting back out there for people to maybe respond to.
Yeah, I think for me, I posed this question the other day on my Instagram, which is at Chapters Creative. I had to plug, I'm sure I had an opportunity to plug later, but I think it's just, why are you doing what you're doing? What are your reasons? Like, of course, like it should be as simple as like making money, but I want you to go deeper, right? So I think, especially like I hear from other people like, oh, your first year being in therapy, like you're just so into it or whatever. So this is me being super into therapy right now.
But that
Yeah,
everybody should be into therapy,
everybody.
to be honest.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, to be fair. But it's kind of, I think that's why like when I have certain clients say it feels like therapy, because I'm really getting deeper into their motivations, why they do what they
mhm.
do. So it could be, what's the reason why you even got into what you did in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So like if you have creatives, like think about like that time when you're 5 or 6 years old, and how can what you went through in your unique life specifically help people. So for me,
Mm,
like when people say like, oh, I got into like wrestling, whatever, some people might scoff at that. But it's like the things I learned while experiencing like that media and stuff like that, it can help people. And that's my unique story, whether it's
yeah.
like being a musician and sleeping on floors or collaborating and things like. So I just want people to think about like the things in their life that brought them to where they are now, in order for them to say, I think I want to help people with this
Yeah.
thing, right? Just think about that as far as, yeah, you're doing the one thing, but what happened in your life to get to that point?
I
And
love that's such a great starting point for like origin stories
mhm.
and the lore of your brand, the lore of your personal brand. I love
Mhm.
this. So you said Chapters Creative. Of
Mhm.
course, we can follow you on Instagram. Is there
Mhm.
any other places? Plug the podcast, plug all the things. Tell me all the things
Yeah.
that are going on.
So you can go to my website, chapterscreative.com, where you can kind of learn the like kind of the basics of what I do. I also have the podcast called The Pod of Never, which is kind of a play on my band name, Swans of Never.
Yeah.
I've had some of my favorite creators and musicians on there. So if you come from kind of like underground punk or hardcore type of world, like you might be surprised of who I've had on there. I'm not saying I've had like any huge gets or anything
No, no,
like
no.
that,
But
but like that's
you,
kind of like
yeah, if they've
the
dug in and they know, they'll
the
know.
flavor. It's like the flavor of what I do.
Yeah.
And then I'm also on TikTok, I believe Chapters Creative as well. And you can email me at chapterscrtv@gmail.com if you have any questions or you want to get to work with me. My website I think does a pretty good job of communicating how you can work with me and why. But yeah, but if you have any other questions, you can get a hold of me there too.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope you all continue to follow your muse as well and go follow Matthew.
Yes.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Jordan.